The first time the Whitmore family looked at Daniel Carter, they didn't see a man. They saw a stain on their perfect afternoon. A stranger in a faded grey jacket and scuffed brown boots, standing at the edge of a private school fundraiser he had no business attending, holding the hand of a little girl in a hand-me-down pink backpack. If you have ever been judged before you even opened your mouth, if you have ever watched someone's eyes flick from your shoes to your face and quietly decide you were beneath them, stay with me, because what happened to Daniel that afternoon will change the way you look at every ordinary, tired-looking person you pass on the street. And if this story moves you even a little, do me a favor right now, hit like and subscribe, because you are not going to want to miss where this goes. Daniel was 35 years old, though grief and exhaustion had carved a few extra years into the lines around his eyes. He had short, dark brown hair that he cut himself in the bathroom mirror to save money, a permanent trace of stubble because razors were a luxury he rationed, and the kind of tired brown eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. He worked as the maintenance man and part-time janitor at Brookstone Preparatory Academy, the very same elite school his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, attended on a hardship scholarship he had fought 3 separate committees to secure. He mopped floors before sunrise and fixed broken heating pipes after sunset, and in between, he made sure his daughter never once felt like the poorest kid in a hallway full of designer backpacks. Nobody at that school knew what Daniel used to be. Nobody knew that 6 years earlier, before the fire that took his wife and nearly took his daughter's life too, Daniel Carter had been one of the most promising trauma surgeons in the state, a man who had graduated at the top of his class, who had built a reputation for staying in the operating room long after other surgeons would have given up on a patient. He had walked away from all of it, the title, the income, the recognition, the night his wife died, and Lily was left with lungs so damaged from smoke that doctors weren't sure she would make it through the week. He sold his share of the practice to pay for her treatment. He sold the house, he sold his car, and when the money ran out and Lily was finally, miraculously, breathing on her own again, Daniel didn't go back to surgery. He couldn't. Every operating room reminded him of the one night he couldn't save the person he loved most, and so he chose the quietest, most invisible job he could find, one that let him pick his daughter up from school every single day and never miss another moment with her again. He remembered that night more clearly than he remembered most of his own wedding. The smoke alarm screaming through the hallway, the heat pressing against his skin like a living thing, his wife, Rachel, pushing Lily's small body into his arms through a doorway that was already collapsing, telling him to go, just go. She was right behind him, and then she wasn't. He remembered carrying his daughter down 3 flights of stairs with her lungs already failing, remembered the paramedics pulling her from his arms at the curb, remembered standing in the street in his bare feet watching the house he had built with his own 2 hands fold in on itself, taking his wife with it. He remembered, most of all, the 6 weeks that followed in the pediatric ICU, sitting beside a ventilator that breathed for his daughter because her scarred lungs couldn't yet do it themselves, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore that he would not have to bury both the people he loved most in the same month. Lily lived, Rachel did not. And something in Daniel, the steady clinical part of him that other surgeons envied, the part that could hold a scalpel over a dying stranger without his hands ever trembling, broke in a way that never fully mended. He couldn't walk back into an operating room without hearing that smoke alarm, so he didn't. He chose floor mops and flickering light bulbs instead, because a mop had never once asked him to save a life he wasn't sure he could save again, and because it let him be home every single evening to tuck his daughter into bed and tell her, truthfully, that he would never leave her. That was the man standing at the edge of the Whitmore family's charity gala fundraiser, the one thrown every year to raise scholarship money for Brookstone's less fortunate students, the very program that let his daughter walk those polished marble hallways. Daniel hadn't planned to attend. He'd only come to drop off a folding table for the event when the school's events coordinator, flustered and short-staffed, begged him to stay and help set up chairs. Lily had tagged along because there was no one to watch her, and she'd worn her favorite dress, faded at the hem but washed and pressed with more care than any store-bought gown, because to Daniel, taking care of what you have was its own kind of wealth. It was Eleanor Whitmore who noticed them first. Eleanor, with her diamond earrings that cost more than Daniel made in 2 years, took one look at the man in the grey jacket setting up folding chairs and the little girl sitting quietly in the corner, and she said, just loud enough for the people around her to hear, that she didn't understand why the school let just anyone wander into an event like this. Her husband, Richard Whitmore, the silver-haired CEO of Whitmore Regional Health Systems, didn't even look up from his phone. Their teenage son, Marcus, smirked and made a comment about the help bringing their kids to work. Lily heard it. She was 7, but she was old enough to understand the tone even if she didn't understand every word, and she slid closer to her father's leg and gripped his hand tighter. Daniel felt his chest tighten with a familiar, exhausted kind of pain. Not for himself. He could handle being looked down on. He'd made his peace with that trade a long time ago. But for his daughter, who had done nothing but exist in a room where her father wasn't wearing the right jacket. He said nothing. There was nothing to say to people who had already decided who he was before he'd spoken a single word. He finished setting up the chairs, careful and unhurried, because he refused to let anyone see his hands shake, and he thanked the coordinator, and he took Lily's hand and walked toward the exit, past the ice sculptures and the string quartet and the table of donors bidding on a weekend yacht trip as if it were pocket change. Halfway to the door, Lily tugged his sleeve and asked, in the small, honest voice only a 7-year-old can manage, why the lady with the sparkly earrings didn't like them. Daniel knelt down right there on the marble floor, ignoring the stares, and told his daughter the only truth he had ever wanted her to carry, that some people needed a fancy jacket to feel important, and that was their own quiet sadness to carry, not hers. He told her that kindness was worth more than every diamond in that room, and that she should never, ever let anyone convince her otherwise. Lily nodded solemnly, the way children do when they don't fully understand the words but understand completely the love behind them, and together they walked out into the parking lot as the sun went down, leaving behind a ballroom full of people who had no idea what they had just dismissed. And that would have been the end of it, a quiet humiliation folded into a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of moment that happens to invisible people every single day and no one ever thinks about again. Except fate, or maybe something more deliberate than fate, wasn't finished with the Whitmore family yet. 3 weeks later, Marcus Whitmore, 17 years old and full of the reckless confidence that came from never once being told no, borrowed his father's sports car without permission to impress a girl from his class. He was showing off on a wet road half a mile from Brookstone Academy when he lost control. The car spun, clipped a guardrail, and rolled twice before coming to rest against a tree. It happened close enough to the school that the sound of the crash rattled the windows of the maintenance closet where Daniel was replacing a fuse. Daniel didn't think. He ran. 20 years of instinct, buried under 6 years of grief, rose up in him the moment he saw the smoke curling from beneath the crumpled hood and heard a teenage voice inside screaming for help. He didn't wait for the ambulance. He didn't wait for permission. He wrenched open the driver's door with his bare hands, ignoring the way the metal tore at his palms, and found Marcus Whitmore pinned by the steering column, blood running from a gash above his eyebrow, his breathing shallow and wet in a way that made every buried surgical instinct in Daniel's body scream a single word: hemothorax. Internal bleeding into the chest cavity. The boy had maybe minutes before his lung collapsed entirely. For 6 years he had told himself he would never do this again. Never let this version of himself surface, never risk the kind of heartbreak that came with holding someone's life in his hands. But there was no ambulance close enough. There was no time to wait for one, and no time left for 6 years of grief to argue with a part of him that had taken an oath long before the fire ever touched his life. Daniel Carter, janitor, maintenance man, single father, former trauma surgeon, made a decision in half a second that would change everything. He barked orders at the horrified teenage girl standing frozen nearby, sent her running for the school nurse's kit. And with nothing but a pocket knife he sanitized with a lighter from his truck and the kind of steady hands that 6 years of mopping floors had never managed to erase, he performed an emergency needle decompression on a 17-year-old boy on the side of a rain-slicked road, saving his life in the 11 minutes before the ambulance arrived. When the paramedics pulled up, they found a boy who should have been dead and a man in a stained grey jacket kneeling over him, his hands slick with blood, calmly reciting vital signs and treatment notes like a man who had done this 1,000 times before because he had. One of the paramedics, a woman who had worked county trauma calls for 15 years, stared at Daniel with an expression of pure disbelief. "Who taught you to do that?" she asked. Daniel just looked down at his shaking, blood-covered hands, the hands he had spent 6 years trying to forget belonged to a surgeon, and said quietly, "I used to be someone else." The hospital called it a miracle. The surgeon who took over Marcus's case in the operating room later told Richard Whitmore, with something like awe in his voice, that if that decompression hadn't been performed exactly when and exactly how it was, his son would not have survived the ambulance ride. When Richard asked who had done it, the answer stunned him into silence. The maintenance man. The one his wife had dismissed at the fundraiser, the one his son had mocked. That same man had knelt in the rain and pulled his boy back from the edge of death with a pocket knife and a memory he had tried to bury forever. Richard Whitmore drove to Brookstone Academy the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes, and found Daniel exactly where he always was, on a ladder replacing a flickering hallway light, Lily doing her homework on a bench nearby because it was a teacher in-service day and there was nowhere else for her to be. Richard stood at the bottom of that ladder for a long moment, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated hospital mergers, utterly unable to find the right words. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you for my son's life," and his voice broke on the last word in a way that surprised even him. In the days that followed, Lily was allowed to visit the hospital with her father, and it was there, in a quiet corridor smelling of antiseptic and old coffee, that she saw a side of her father she had never known existed. She watched nurses greet him with a strange, reverent familiarity, watched a senior surgeon shake his hand and call him one of the best I ever trained under, watched grown adults in white coats look at her quiet, grey-jacketed father, the way she had always looked at him, like he was someone extraordinary. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she tucked the memory away carefully, the way children do, with the moments that will one day explain everything about who their parents really are. It was Eleanor who did the digging that Richard, in his gratitude and disbelief, hadn't thought to do. Within 2 days, she had learned the truth of who Daniel Carter really was. Not a nobody who had gotten lucky with a pocket knife, but Dr. Daniel Carter, once one of the most gifted trauma surgeons in the region. A man whose name still appeared in medical journals for a technique he had pioneered before he was 30. She learned about the fire, she learned about his wife. She learned about the house he sold, the practice he walked away from, the 6 years he had spent quietly, invisibly, rebuilding a life around a little girl who needed her father more than the world needed another surgeon. And when she read all of it, the woman who had once looked at Daniel like he didn't belong in the room, sat alone in her study and wept, ashamed of every assumption she had made in the 3 seconds it took her to glance at his jacket instead of his heart. The Whitmores did not simply write a check and call it even, though they tried. Daniel refused the money, quietly and firmly, the same way he had refused to explain himself at the fundraiser. He hadn't saved Marcus for a reward. He had saved him because a boy was dying, and Daniel, whatever else he had given up, had never stopped being a person who ran toward the fire instead of away from it. What moved Daniel instead, what finally cracked the careful wall he had built around his old life, was something smaller and far more human. It was Eleanor Whitmore showing up at Brookstone a week later, Not with her diamonds or her assistant, but alone, sitting down on the bench beside Lily and asking the little girl, gently, what her favorite subject was. It was Richard Whitmore, quietly arranging, without ever mentioning it, to Daniel, for Lily's remaining tuition to be covered not through charity but through a scholarship fund created in the name of the wife Daniel had lost. A fund meant to honor ordinary people who had given up everything for someone they loved. Richard set it up quietly through the school's finance office, insisting no one mention his name, because for the first time in years he understood that some gifts mean more when they ask for nothing in return. Not gratitude, not headlines, not even a thank you card. It was a small, private way of saying that the family who had once looked past Daniel Carter now saw him, fully and completely, for exactly who he was. It was Marcus, once he was well enough to walk again, showing up at the maintenance closet with his father, unable to meet Daniel's eyes at first and saying only, "I'm sorry for what I said that day, and thank you for not letting me die for it." Daniel, who had spent 6 years believing that the man he used to be was gone for good, felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt since the fire. Not forgiveness exactly, because there had never been anything to forgive on his end, but recognition that people could be wrong about you in an instant and right about you forever after, if you gave them the chance to see past the jacket. The hospital board, informed of what had happened on that rain-soaked road, quietly reached out to Daniel about returning to medicine. Not to the grueling, all-consuming trauma schedule that had once cost him nearly everything, but to a role he could shape around his daughter, teaching emergency response to young surgeons, consulting on trauma protocols, being present for every school pickup and every bedtime story, while still, finally, being allowed to be who he really was. Daniel said yes, not for himself, but because Lily deserved to see her father stand tall in the light instead of hiding in the shadows of a maintenance closet, however noble the reason had once been. Months later, Brookstone Academy held another fundraiser, in the very same ballroom where Eleanor Whitmore had once looked at Daniel like an intruder. This time, Daniel walked in wearing a simple, well-fitted suit, Lily's hand in his, her dress new but no fancier than it needed to be, because Daniel had never wanted his daughter to learn that worth was measured in fabric. Eleanor crossed the room the moment she saw them, knelt down to Lily's eye level, and told her, in front of everyone, what a remarkable father she had. And Richard Whitmore stood on stage that night and told the entire room the story of the man in the grey jacket, the man they had almost turned away, the man whose secret sacrifice had saved his son's life and whose quiet grace had saved something in all of them. He didn't do it to embarrass anyone. He did it because he believed, and he was right, that everyone in that room needed to hear it, that the person you dismiss without a second glance might be carrying more courage, more loss, and more love than you will ever know, and that the truest measure of a person is never the jacket on their back, but what they were willing to sacrifice for someone else's tomorrow. Years later, when Lily was old enough to understand every piece of the story, the fire, the mother she barely remembered, the operating rooms her father had walked away from, the pocket knife on the side of a rain-soaked road, she would tell people that her father never once talked about that day, the way the world eventually would. He never called himself a hero. He never mentioned the boy he saved, or the family that once looked through him like he was invisible. When she asked him why, sitting beside him on the porch of the modest house they finally truly called their own, Daniel just squeezed her hand and told her that heroes weren't the people who saved a life once in front of a crowd. Heroes were the people who showed up quietly, every single day, for no audience at all. The ones who folded the laundry and made the lunches and sat through every fever at 3 a.m, long before anyone was watching. He told her that the pocket knife on that road hadn't made him who he was. It had only finally let the world see who he had been all along. Lily Carter grew up knowing exactly who her father was, not because he told her, but because she watched him live it every single day, long before the world ever caught up to the truth. And somewhere in that lesson is the one Daniel would want every single viewer of this story to carry with them when the screen goes dark, The world is full of quiet people doing extraordinary things for the ones they love, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply showing up again and again in the only way they know how. Look twice before you judge the jacket, the car, the worn-out shoes, or the tired eyes of the stranger standing quietly at the edge of the room. You never know what they have survived to get there. You never know what they have sacrificed so someone else could smile. And you never know, until the moment truly arrives, whose steady, ordinary hands might one day be the very ones that save you.